Missouri State Auditor Nicole Galloway, and I'm here this evening to present the results of the audit of your city government. I'm joined here tonight by Audit Director Regina Pruitt, Audit Manager Pam Allison, Auditors Ted Fugit and Connie James, Caitlin Cross, and Marion Sievers, who are involved in the preparation of this audit report. I also want to thank Missouri Southern State University for the use of their facilities and allowing us to present this public presentation. And I'd like to recognize city leaders, city staff, and employees for their participation and cooperation during the audit report. I'd like to thank the petitioners and the thousands of citizens who signed the petition to request this audit. But most of all, I want to recognize you, the citizens of Joplin. We are here tonight because you care deeply about your city government, and how it affects your fellow citizens. Throughout the audit process, my staff received information from citizens for consideration during the audit process. Each one of these items were reviewed, and if they rose to a level of a finding, they are included in the audit report. The story of Joplin is one of triumph over tragedy, and ultimately it is a success story. This audit is not just about pointing out serious problems, it's about identifying solutions and making improvements. It's about standards and safeguards that could have prevented many of the issues that you'll hear about tonight. This audit is about making sure your elected leaders and the institutions of your city government meet the needs of the city of Joplin. As former treasurer of Boone County, I understand how important and efficient local government is, because I've had people in my office concerned about their roads and concerned about their public safety. And they count on their local leaders to provide services and to provide trust in the effectiveness of their government. As State Auditor, it's my job to ensure government is held accountable to the people it represents, however uncomfortable it may be for leaders, elected officials, contractors, or constituents to hear and be forced to address. When the tornado tore through this city, thousands of people from across the state and across the country came to help the city of Joplin. Unfortunately, as the audit makes clear, in the months that followed, others came to profit in the aftermath of that tragedy. Frankly, certain individuals took advantage not just of you here in Joplin, but the entire state that answered the call for help. Specifically, a salesman named David Wallace, who came to Joplin promising a new, reimagined future for the city. Instead, a company owned by Wallace and his partner, Coast of Joplin, delivered disappointment, frustration, and waste, as their promises fell through and their plans for the future never materialized. There's no question of the failure of Wallace-Bajali Development Partners, of the men who promised so much to the people so hopeful and failed to deliver on those promises. The question now is, how did this happen? How did Wallace-Bajali integrate themselves into the city's organization and win a lucrative contract, despite a clear inability to handle a project of this magnitude based on the lack of resources and a dismal track record? Why were so many red flags ignored and essential checks and balances non-existent? And how was so much of this done behind closed doors shielded from public view? In the end, why did city leaders go into business with Wallace-Bajali? And more than 4 years later, has the city spent millions of taxpayers' dollars with no development to show for it? That's what we'll explore here tonight, step by step. The findings that I'm reviewing tonight are a result of the audit conducted by my staff here in Joplin starting in September 2014 through March 2015. The report gives the municipal government a performance rating of 4, and there's 13 audit areas, findings in 13 audit areas. The purpose of the master developer was to create a public-private partnership to assist in guiding redevelopment in the area most affected by the tornado. This would be accomplished through a combination of residential and commercial real estate projects that corresponded with pre-existing goals for development in the city. David Wallace spoke of his experience with this type of work, experience that would later be determined to be exaggerated at best. He outlined plans for redevelop Joplin with homes, a library theater district, and a minor league baseball stadium. By December, the CART's implementation task force was sold on the idea of a master developer, and they recommended it to the City Council. By the end of the month, the city had issued a request for proposal for the master developer. In other words, a request for proposal, or as you might know as an RFP, is an invitation for developers to come and bid. It was written by a chamber employee after Wallace Pajali emailed that chamber employee a draft. The document appears to favor Wallace Pajali Development Partners and the plans they pitched in their many meetings with the chamber and CART representatives over the previous few months. The RFP was issued in December and asked developers to submit responses and letters of intent. A letter of intent is when a developer says, if I move forward with this project, I'm interested in participating. Due to the quick turnaround time of only 1 month to submit proposals, some bidders didn't have any letters of intent. They didn't have enough time to obtain them. Others had limited letters of intent, but Wallace Pajali had 15. Now on the surface, that does seem impressive, until you realize they've been working on securing these letters for much longer than the 1-month RFP period. In fact, 11 of the 15 letters were dated before the RFP was even issued, some as far as 4 months in advance. Now, take a step back and said another way, they started obtaining letters of intent just a few months after the tornado. One of the letters named Wallace Pajali as the master developer for Joplin, and was dated a month before the CART even recommended a master developer to the City Council. At best, it's an unfair advantage. At worst, Wallace Pajali was manipulating the process. This should have been the first of many red flags for local officials. And when it came time for the city to score the proposals, that process seemed to favor Wallace Pajali from the outset. Now there's a table in the report on page 11 that shows the different scores that respondents to the RFP provided. Despite being in business for only 5 years, Wallace Pajali scored the highest, or close to the highest, in every category on the evaluation form, including those categories related to success of track record and financial capability and stability. This, even though the company had multiple projects enter into bankruptcy and was at the time facing a substantial fine by the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission and pending litigation regarding other projects. More red flags should have occurred with reference checks. At least one member of the CART implementation task force had serious doubts about the company's ability to deliver. References came back noting that the company had a history of coming up short. One reference said Joplin should, quote, stay away as far as you can. Quote, big hats, no cattle. And the city would, quote, be making a huge mistake to be involved with them. Another reference provided a statement that would prove prophetic for the city. The reference reported David Wallace, quote, talked a good game, but nothing had happened yet. Despite concerns raised by members, the CART Implementation Task Force recommended Wallace Pajali Development Partners to the City Council, and the Joplin Redevelopment Corporation entered into a pre-development agreement with Wallace Pajali in July 2012. A pre-development agreement that appears to have been written to unreasonably benefit Wallace Pajali. The agreement provided the city to reimburse Wallace Pajali 50% of these so-called pursuit costs up to $1 million. Wallace Pajali submitted over $2 million in invoices. The city paid $1 million in reimbursements, despite the fact that Wallace Pajali didn't fulfill the terms of the agreement and the company missed contractual deadlines to submit some invoices. And of that $1 million, it appears that $33,000 included expenses incurred by Wallace Pajali to develop that RFP and respond to that RFP. Expenses that the RFP specifically stated would not be reimbursed. That's $33,000 that should not have been paid under any circumstances, but was paid out by the city. Now, to the city's credit, there is an additional $312,000 in expenses mailed by Walls Bajali, but correctly denied for reimbursement. These denied expenses, which are described in a little bit more detail on page 17 if you wanted to flip along, included a series of 305 invoices, which included a pair of men's dress shoes, a bar tab for drinks purchased by David Wallace, close to Bajali, the former mayor, former city manager, cart chairperson, and chamber employee. A hotel stay in Arkansas from approximately 4 months before Joplin issued the RFP. Again, these costs were submitted by Wallace Bajali, but were not reimbursed by the city. But what they do show is a pattern, and should have served as warning signs to the city about the company that it was in business with. And as for the previously mentioned $1 million, it was paid out in a series of payments to a third party to repay a loan made by a trucking company. That was done at the request of Wallace Bajali via email, an employee of Wallace Bajali via email, with no record of discussion of the unusual nature of the request or circumstances. And most importantly, none of the payments were brought before the City Council for public discussion. Now, taking a step back, what would be possibly a real-world example of that? Let's say you owe your leasing company your rent check. You go to pay your rent to your leasing company, and the receptionist says, instead of paying the leasing company for that rent check, why don't you go ahead and write the check to a mechanic in another town, and we'll just call that will count that for your rent. And that's with no manager approval. It's just you who did unreasonable. My office's review found the master developer selection process and agreement terms to be flawed. In the end, the city spent $1 million in wasted pursuit costs. But that's just the beginning. While this was unfolding, Wallace Bajali was also getting paid by the city through the land assemblage agreement. The land assemblage agreement required the Joplin Redevelopment Corporation, known as the JRC, to pay Wallace Bajali a fee for properties that were bought and sold in the redevelopment zone. This amounted to $475,000, and some of those fees were questionable and excessive. That included a $57,500 payment to Wallace Bajali when the JRC entered an agreement to purchase land for a hospital from the hospital for a proposed science and discovery center. Plans were later canceled and that property was reverted back to the hospital, but Wallace Bajali kept the money. In other words, the city paid over $57,000 and no development took place. Ultimately, we have Wallace Bajali, an unqualified entity who targeted Joplin, secured a lucrative contract despite a number of red flags and almost $1.5 million in taxpayer dollars spent with nothing to show for it. Not a single piece of property was developed by Wallace Bajali. But in contrast, during that same time, an incredible amount of redevelopment has taken place in this city through other groups and organizations. The Housing Authority of the City of Joplin rebuilt 130 homes within a year and a half of the tornado. The Joplin Homebuyers Assistance Program helped city residents build 260 homes. I mentioned a few minutes ago, JRC. The JRC is a component of city government. Its purpose was to borrow funds to purchase property for redevelopment and sell that property to developers, including the city's master developer, Wallace Bajali. The JRC has spent approximately $11 million from a loan, city funds, and state tax credits to acquire that property. Nearly $140,000 had been spent in interest costs. This included more than $8 million to purchase 36 properties in the redevelopment area. And that's why I'll direct your attention to here. This represents the 36 properties that were selected for redevelopment. In green, we have 20 properties that the JRC purchased directly from original owners. What we have here in blue are 16 properties that were scooped up first by 4 State Homes. And 4 State Homes is owned by Charlie King, something that we'll reference just a little bit later. But these 16 properties were first scooped up by 4 state homes and then in a short time purchased and flipped by the JRC. Those 16 properties were flipped for a markup of about 39%, or for a total markup of over $377,000. Essentially what we have is a taxpayer-funded house flipping plan with no development made or improvements made to these properties. And some of these examples were extreme. If you turn to page 25, you'll see a table that references these 16 properties that were scooped up by 4 state homes and then flipped to the JRC. Now, the one that we'll talk about on this board is just the first one on the table on page 25, and it's a good example of what I'm referencing. 1801 Delaware Street. In July 2013, it was purchased by 4 state homes for $35,000. About a month later, in August 2013, it was sold to the JRC for $165,000. That means there was a markup of over 450%, or about $130,000. All of these properties scooped up by 4 state homes have the same person listed as the broker on the real estate contracts, Councilmember Mike Woolston. When brokering these sales, Mr. Woolston was aware that the properties were in the redevelopment zone. He was also aware that the JRC would attempt to purchase the properties for redevelopment because Mr. Woolston was a member of CART. Councilmember Woolston's employer received $11,000 for brokering the sales of these properties. It's also worth mentioning the unusual circumstances surrounding the appraisals or lack of appraisals for the properties. Although appraisals are generally accepted requirement for real estate transactions, the JRC did not obtain independent appraisals before entering into the purchase agreements for any of those 16 properties it purchased from 4 state homes. It also failed to obtain independent appraisals for the majority of the properties it purchased directly from original property owners. As a result of the failure to perform independent appraisals, the JRC spent approximately $675,000 more than the estimated values of the properties, with the intent of selling the properties to the master developer, Galloway and affiliates. One of the affiliates was NewCo. NewCo was a new company formed by Charlie King, who I mentioned earlier, and Galloway. Those 16 properties that were scooped up by 4 state homes and flipped to the JRC were supposed to be then resold to NewCo. However, that contract fell through. So what we have is those 16 properties purchased first by 4 state homes, a short time later purchased by the JRC. They were supposed to go to NewCo, but that never went through, and now JRC is still holding those properties. That means that 4 state homes bought these properties for pennies on the dollar, inflated the prices, then sold to the JRC as a markup. And the JRC was left holding the properties at the expense of Joplin taxpayers. This is an extreme example of waste, and it illustrates that when government officials become so entangled in business dealings with the government, it leads to distrust in the system, and a distrust with the people who are elected to represent our own best interests. Meanwhile, as money was being paid towards development that was not happening, the city was also not filing reimbursement claims for federal and state disaster recovery grant funds in a timely manner. This is on page 34 of the report. As of this past May, reimbursement claim forms had not been filed for at least $6.6 million in FEMA grant funds and $2.7 million in community block grant funds for completed projects. That's more than $9 million left on the table, money that could have been put to use here in your city. So how did this all happen without the public knowing, or at least without knowing all of it? The answer to that question brings us to finding Area 4 on Missouri Sunshine Law, which begins on page 42 of the report. Here in the Show Me State, governing bodies are required to ensure their meetings are open to the public. There are exceptions that allow the government to hold closed meetings, but even then they're required to keep meeting minutes and to make those meeting minutes available to the public. The Joplin City Council failed to take notes in 10 closed session meetings through October 2013. Many significant discussions regarding disaster recovery and redevelopment were discussed and determined during that time period, but there were no meeting minutes prepared or made available to the public. Now, to their credit, city officials improved procedures and did maintain minutes in closed sessions starting in November 2013. However, meeting minutes were also not prepared for council work sessions. These sessions included planning discussions and project updates from Wallace to Joplin. Because minutes were not prepared, Joplin citizens lost the opportunity to understand and be involved in the redevelopment process in their own city. And that brings us here tonight. The key is to determining what went wrong and to prevent this type of mismanagement in the future. The Missouri Sunshine Law exists to ensure the people's business is done in view of the people, to allow you to have a say in the actions your government takes on your behalf and the decisions it makes that directly impact your community. Though finding areas 1 through 4 are highlighted here tonight, the findings in the remainder of the report are just as important to an effective city government. The audit found there was a lack of necessary checks and balances and multiple financial processes. Policies and procedures should have been adopted and enforced, especially regarding controls over significant change orders in the Public Works Department and checks and balances over cash receipts with missing receipt numbers from the accounting system. After months of audit work and many missing records and documents, and a number of unanswered questions, the audit staff was forced to take the unusual step of issuing subpoenas to compel testimony and to require production of relevant documents. After staff completed the depositions and after reviewing additional records provided through the subpoena process, staff notified appropriate state and federal law enforcement agencies and the Jasper County prosecuting attorney to investigate whether there were any criminal violations involved. Long-term mismanagement of public dollars is unacceptable, and those responsible should be held accountable. What we highlight in the report are findings that occurred months and years after the tornado. The events outlined here for you tonight highlight what happens when best practices and standard procedures are bypassed, when laws designed to keep government operating in the open are ignored, when government leaders blur the lines between business dealings and the people's business, and when city contractors get too cozy with those trusted to represent the best interests of citizens. That's when the citizens' interest gets lost, and we lose public trust, a trust that is an absolute requirement for local effective government. As I noted earlier, the story of Joplin is a story of resilience, and it's a story not yet completed. It is my hope that the transparency provided by this audit will serve as a starting place for a better Joplin City government to emerge. I am encouraged by the City Council's responses to the audit, which are included in the audit report. And in many instances, the City Council has already begun implementing recommendations. And I look forward to seeing how city officials continue that progress. Now, I'm sure there are some members of the public that might have a few questions regarding this public presentation, and so I'd be happy to take a few questions. Okay. Well,
you mentioned the appraisals on the JRC properties. I thought every property did have an appraisal on it.
So the question was, were appraisals done of the properties that JRC purchased? And our audit findings found that independent appraisals were not performed on the properties. In some instances, after the JRC entered into contracts, the bank that in-house appraisals or in-home appraisals for some of those properties, but those were done after the contract price was already settled. The question was, for those that may not be able to hear, is how does the city council address the increased value in those homes and make them affordable again for people to move back into the area? And that's a question for the city council. That's not something that the audit report speaks to. You know, what my hope is in this audit report, there are concrete recommendations that lay a path forward, specific improvements that can be implemented to regain trust and to improve the transparent and efficient manner in which your city government operates. And part of holding the city government accountable, I feel like there's two methods for that. One is through the citizens, through us, holding our leaders accountable. The other is through the audit process, shining a light on these things and allowing citizens, the press, and others to explore those issues and to make sure there's findings and recommendations that are upheld. I do want to point out, and something that I think is worth mentioning, is that because there's a performance rating of 4, we will conduct a follow-up audit and review of the Joplin municipal government. And just to talk about that for a second so you understand how that process works. We'll work with the city to develop a timeline to see when it's reasonable for them to implement these selected findings and recommendations. And in that, we'll come back then after a reasonable amount of time and see if those have been implemented, partially implemented, not implemented at all. And those results are made public. It doesn't look like there's any more questions in the audit. Oh, yes, sir.
Could you please tell me, ma'am, you stated in here it had an effect on the general fund. How much money is owed to the general fund because of the lack of collection in a disaster?
Yes. There is over, in aggregate, there's over $10 million that is waiting for the city to be claimed. Part of that is FEMA grant funds, part of that is state grant funds, and part of that is insurance proceeds that the insurance companies are holding in reserve for the city to claim. Well, oh, yes, sir.
Among the citizenry in the area, this results, although the specifics were not known, most people are not terribly surprised by what you are saying. We all knew something was up. This audit, if I'm not incorrect, only happened because businessmen and people got a petition going and signed a petition to asking for your office and your predecessor to begin that process. In view of that, how is the citizenry, or how are the people to protect themselves? Would the answer only be by involvement, taking an active role, being unpopular maybe, and filling out petitions to get someone like you in your office involved in this sort of thing? Obviously, it's something that should have, it might have been a good idea if that had happened several years ago. And I'm wondering, is that really the recourse that we have for keeping people on?
The question for those that may not have heard is how does the general citizenry, what avenues do they have to hold their city leaders accountable? And, you know, I do think that in one instance, being engaged, as you have said, being an engaged citizen, participating in your role of government certainly makes a difference. Clearly, the residents here in Joplin care about their city and care about their municipal government. That petition became active in August 2014, meaning there was enough verified signatures, and we performed our audit work from September 2014 to March 2015. And one thing that I do want to reference that you said was this audit did start under Auditor Tom Schweik. And one of the things that I think he wanted to do was bring the auditor's office closer to citizens and closer to constituents and the people that we're serving. are still in reserve to be claimed. Now, if anybody has any follow-up questions, we do have a 1-800 number that you can call, and it's in off hours, it's 8 to 5, but in the off hours you can leave a voicemail, you can do that anonymously, or you can do that and leave your contact information. You can also email our email address if you have follow-up questions